June 3, 1942. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the Pacific War reached its inflection point. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Japanese Combined Fleet, planned a decisive, crushing blow against the U.S. base at Midway Atoll, designed to destroy the remaining U.S. carriers and force a favorable peace. Compelling evidence, Yamamoto committed 4 of his 6 irreplaceable fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, and a vast supporting armada. An immense strategic risk premised on achieving total surprise and overwhelming material superiority. The centerpiece of his plan was deception, a preliminary attack on the Aleutian Islands designed to draw the U.S. carriers north, leaving Midway exposed to his main strike force. Insightful expert, quote, "The American defense was entirely predicated on a singular triumph of intelligence, Operation Magic. Cryptographers had successfully broken the Japanese naval code, JN-25B, giving Admiral Chester Nimitz the precise date, target, AF, confirmed to be Midway, and disposition of the enemy fleet. Vivid example. To confirm the intelligence, the U.S. Navy broadcast a message that Midway's freshwater system had broken down. A subsequent intercepted Japanese message confirmed, AF is short of water, validating the target and allowing Nimitz to lay his trap. The rich explanation for the American advantage is that they deployed their 3 available carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, in ambush positions northeast of Midway, waiting for the predictable Japanese approach, reversing the traditional element of surprise. Intelligence dictates position. Superior signals intelligence reverses the strategic advantage, allowing the weaker force to position an ambush. Midway was a trap set in code. Dawn, June 4, 1942. The Japanese launched their first wave of aircraft against Midway Atoll, achieving tactical destruction but committing a fatal strategic blunder that exposed their carriers. Compelling evidence. At 04:30, the Japanese launched 108 aircraft for the first strike on Midway. While the attack neutralized the base's air defenses and oil storage, the damage was insufficient to prevent the airfield from operating later that day. Crucially, the Japanese striking force commanders, believing the base was still functional, recommended a second, decisive strike on the shore installations, committing their returning aircraft for rearming with land attack ordnance, fragmentation, and high-explosive bombs. Insightful expert, quote, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the carrier fleet, made the pivotal command decision to comply with the request for a second land strike. This required him to bring up the land attack bombs from the ordnance magazines and begin the slow, dangerous process of rearming the planes that had just returned. Vivid example. As the crews worked frantically on the hangar decks with fuel lines open and thousands of bombs and torpedoes stacked on the deck, Nagumo received a shocking reconnaissance report. 10 enemy surface ships, which appear to be carriers, sighted. Nagumo now had to rearm his entire second wave with anti-ship torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs in a panic. The rich explanation for Nagumo's confusion is that the Japanese doctrine mandated keeping the reserve strike armed with anti-ship weapons, but the tactical situation at Midway created an impossible logistical scramble to switch ordnance twice, leaving his hangar decks disastrously vulnerable. Logistics dictates crisis. A flawed defensive doctrine compounded by a sudden intelligence shift forces a logistical scramble that creates catastrophic vulnerability. Nagumo's decks became ticking time bombs. While Nagumo struggled to rearm, the U.S. launched its full, desperate strike from the 3 carriers, facing a horrifying statistical reality of annihilation, but setting the stage for history's greatest airstrike. Compelling evidence. The first American attacks were uncoordinated and came in piecemeal waves. First from the slow TBD Devastator torpedo bombers of Hornet and Enterprise. These torpedo squadrons flew directly into the heart of the Japanese defensive perimeter, facing a wall of Japanese combat air patrol, Cope fighters, which were vastly superior to the obsolete Devastators. The American sacrifice was near total. 40 of 42 Devastators were shot down. Insightful expert quote, "The annihilation of the torpedo squadron served a critical, unwitting strategic purpose. By drawing the Japanese CAP down to wave level to destroy the slow, low-flying bombers, the Japanese defense was completely disorganized and positioned too low to intercept the true threat." Vivid example. The sheer commitment of the torpedo pilots, flying straight into certain death without hesitation, is one of the most profound acts of sacrifice in naval history, creating a psychological burdens on the Japanese defense, but guaranteeing the success of the follow-up strike. The rich explanation for the devastator losses is that the Japanese CAP fighters, primarily the fast Zeros, concentrated their fire, flying through the gaps in the anti-aircraft barrage to eliminate the low-flying, unescorted bombers, resulting in a devastating statistical reality of 95%. Casualties. Sacrifice buys opportunity. The utter annihilation of an initial strike can unknowingly draw the enemy's defenses out of position, creating a fatal vulnerability for the follow-up attack. The torpedo pilots paved the way with their lives. The moment of decision arrived when the American SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown arrived, finding the Japanese carriers exposed and vulnerable. A tactical coincidence that changed the course of World War II. Compelling evidence. At 10:22 a.m., the dive bombers, led by commanders like C. Wade McCluskey, arrived precisely over the Japanese carriers. They found the decks in a state of disastrous chaos. Fully fueled and armed aircraft were crowded on the hangar decks, waiting to be moved up to the flight deck. The dive bombers fell from the sky virtually unopposed. The Japanese cap, flying low after destroying the torpedo planes, were completely out of position to defend against the vertical plunge of the Dauntless bombers. Insightful expert, quote, "In a span of just 4 minutes, 3 of the 4 Japanese fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were hit by multiple 1,000-pound bombs. The immediate chain reaction of exploding ordnance and aviation fuel on the hangar decks was catastrophic. Vivid example. The 3 carriers became infernos, rapidly turning into uncontrollable wreckage. The devastating statistical reality was instantaneous. The Japanese fleet had lost 75% of its carrier striking powers in less than 5 minutes of combat, along with hundreds of irreplaceable veteran pilots and mechanics. The rich explanation for the catastrophic destruction is the logistical chaos created by Nagumo's command decision. The concentrated fuel, ordnance, and aircraft on the hangar decks ensured that a few well-placed bombs created a fatal chain reaction explosion that doomed the ships and sealed the battle. Concentrated risk ensures destruction. The confluence of a surprise attack and a logistical vulnerability ensures the catastrophic destruction of key assets. 4 minutes sealed the fate of the Japanese fleet. The destruction of the 3 carriers left Admiral Nagumo with only 1 operational ship, the Hiryu, which mounted a final, desperate counterattack that briefly challenged the American victory. Compelling evidence, the Hiryu launched a strike that successfully located and damaged the U.S. carrier USS Yorktown, which had recently survived hits during the Battle of the Coral Sea. Despite the heroic efforts of the American damage control teams, the Yorktown was fatally wounded and was later sunk by a Japanese submarine, proving the immense destructive power the Japanese still possessed. Insightful expert, quote, "The American retaliatory strike, launched primarily from Enterprise and Hornet, located the Hiryu and quickly disabled it, ensuring that all 4 of Yamamoto's primary strike carriers were lost by the end of June 4th. Vivid example, Yamamoto, realizing the crushing, irreversible statistical reality of the loss. Of the lost 4 carriers, hundreds of planes, and over 3,000 men, ordered a general withdrawal, abandoning the entire operation and confirming the American victory. The rich explanation for the battle's strategic finality is that Japan could not replace the lost carriers, planes, and, crucially, the highly trained veteran aircrews. The U.S., with its massive industrial capacity, could replace all of its losses within a year, permanently shifting the balance of power in the Pacific. Victory defines the future. The total destruction of a vital, irreplaceable asset permanently shifts the strategic balance of power. Midway secured the future Allied victory. The decisive 4 minutes was not a planned masterpiece, but a victory delivered by chance and the relentless determination of American pilots, creating a singular tactical coincidence that defied all odds. The navigator's luck. Compelling evidence. The SBD Dauntless dive bombers, led by Lieutenant Commander C. Wade McCluskey of the USS Enterprise, were critically low on fuel and had spent precious time searching for the Japanese carriers, which had moved from their expected position. McCluskey was only guided to the Japanese fleet by spotting the wake of the Japanese destroyer, the Arashi, which was speeding to rejoin the main fleet after attempting to shell an American submarine. This seemingly random encounter was the crucial link. McCluskey correctly deduced that the destroyer was hurrying back to the carriers, reversing its course to find the enemy. An act of genius in navigation and deduction. Insightful expert, quote, Military analysts often emphasize that the success of the dive bombers was a near-run thing, dependent on McCluskey's refusal to give up the search and his acute observation of the destroyer's wake. A true example of how individual initiative compensated for broader, strategic misdirection. Vivid example. The American strike arrived precisely as the Japanese were fueling and rearming their aircraft on the hangar decks. The vertical plunge of the Dauntless was undefended because the Japanese CAP fighters, positioned low after destroying the torpedo planes, were completely unable to climb in time to intercept the attack. The rich explanation for the timing is the combined failure of the Japanese cap drawn out of position and the logistical chaos on the decks created by Nagumo's double rearming order, creating a window of vulnerability that lasted mere minutes. Deduction trumps planning. In aerial combat, success often hinges on a leader's ability to combine navigation, perseverance, and chance observation to exploit a fleeting tactical opportunity. McCluskey's deduction delivered the fleet. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's struggle was one of logistical agony, and the rapid destruction of his carriers was a definitive demonstration of a statistical reality. The concentrated risk of naval air power. The flammable decks. Compelling evidence. The fatal destruction of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu was not just due to the bomb hits themselves, but the secondary explosions caused by the fuel, bombs, and torpedoes stored on the hangar decks. This logistical concentration of volatile material was a command decision made in panic. A single 1,000-pound bomb hitting the Kagak ignited the fuel lines and stacked ordnance on the hangar deck, leading to a massive internal chain reaction that shredded the ship's superstructure and doomed the carrier almost instantly. Insightful expert quote, "Naval historians note that the sheer speed of the sinking, achieved in less than 15 minutes of actual attack time, was unprecedented. The Japanese carriers were destroyed from the inside out, turning them into uncontrollable infernos." Vivid example. The loss of the highly trained maintenance crews and ordnance men in the hangar deck explosions was arguably a greater strategic blow than the loss of the planes themselves, as these skills were critical and took years to replace. The Japanese air arm was decapitated by the loss of its mechanics. The rich explanation for the immediate finality is that the Japanese design philosophy prioritized aircraft capacity and speed over internal defensive redundancy, making their carriers fatally vulnerable once the hangar deck was breached and ignited. Concentration amplifies destruction. The density of fuel, ordnance, and aircraft on a hangar deck transforms a single bomb hit into a catastrophic, unstoppable chain reaction. The carriers consumed themselves. The Japanese refusal to accept defeat led to a desperate counterattack, which, though tactically successful in sinking the USS Yorktown, consumed their last striking power and affirmed the futility of their plan. The double blow. Compelling evidence. The sole surviving Japanese carrier, the USS Hiryu, launched 2 quick, devastating strikes against the USS Yorktown, mistaking it for a second, fresh American carrier. The first strike hit the Yorktown with 3 bombs, forcing its abandonment. The second strike hit the wounded carrier with 2 torpedoes. The American damage control efforts were legendary. The Yorktown was first successfully saved from a bomb hit, only to be struck again. Despite being abandoned, the ship was later sunk by the Japanese submarine AO 618-168, confirming its ultimate loss and the Japanese destructive resolve. Insightful expert, quote, "The sacrifice of the Yorktown was the only American carrier loss of the battle, but it served as a vital strategic shield, drawing the Hiryu's attention and protecting the Enterprise and Hornet, which delivered the decisive counterblow." Vivid example. The American strike, launched by the now consolidated forces of the Enterprise MAS SSSS-4s and aircrew, quickly located and destroyed the Hiryu, ensuring the statistical reality of the Japanese loss was finalized at 4 carriers and over 248 aircraft. The rich explanation for the continued Japanese aggression is their doctrine of decisive battle, which mandated fighting until the absolute last unit was destroyed. This ideological rigidity prevented a strategic retreat until the entire striking force was annihilated. Focus invites sacrifice. A desperate enemy's focus on a single target can draw their attention away from the true source of danger, enabling a decisive counterattack. Yorktown's sacrifice saved the fleet. The outcome of Midway was not determined by the number of ships lost, but by the irreversible loss of irreplaceable human capital, cementing the battle's strategic finality. The cost of training. Compelling evidence. The Japanese lost 4 heavy carriers and over 248 carrier-based aircraft. However, the truly catastrophic loss was the destruction of hundreds of highly trained veteran pilots, navigators, and ordnance specialists, skills that took years to cultivate. At the start of the war, the Japanese held a critical qualitative advantage in pilot experience. The high attrition rate at Midway fatally depleted this elite pool, creating a pilot gap that Japanese training schools could never fully close before the end of the war. Insightful expert quote, "The Japanese pilot training pipeline was slow, and their doctrine failed to account for mass losses, relying instead on a small core of highly experienced veterans. The loss of this veteran cohort eliminated their qualitative air superiority permanently." Vivid example. In contrast, the U.S. Navy and the American industrial base possessed a vast, efficient training and production pipeline, capable of replacing all of its losses, both material and human, within a year, permanently shifting the statistical balance of power in air warfare. The rich explanation for the irreversible nature of the Japanese loss is their early war success. Their confidence in their small cadre of elite pilots led to a systemic failure to develop a mass training program capable of sustaining the war of attrition that Midway initiated. Human capital is strategic. The loss of irreplaceable veteran personnel in a high-stakes battle permanently cripples a military force's long-term operational capacity. Midway cost Japan its qualitative edge. The Battle of Midway was the definitive geopolitical turning point in the Pacific War, ensuring that the conflict would transition from Japanese conquest to American offense. The shift to the offensive, compelling evidence. The destruction of the 4 Japanese carriers halted their expansionist strategy, ending any immediate threat to the U.S. West Coast or Hawaii and securing the American lines of communication. The victory immediately allowed the U.S. to seize the strategic initiative, leading directly to the decisive First American Offensive at Guadalcanal just 2 months later, fundamentally reversing the course of the war. Insightful expert, quote, "Midway was a command decision victory for Admiral Nimitz, whose willingness to take an immense risk, deploying his entire carrier fleet based solely on intelligence, paid off, validating the use of signals." Intelligence. Magic as the ultimate strategic weapon. Vivid example. The psychological impact was immense. For the Japanese high command, the loss was a shattering blow to morale that was often covered up with exaggerated claims of American losses. For the Americans, it was the first great morale boost since Pearl Harbor, confirming their ultimate belief in victory. The rich explanation for the battle's legacy is that it confirmed the aircraft carrier, not the battleship, as the supreme capital ship, inaugurating a new era of naval warfare, dominated by naval air power. See Midway defined the future of conflict. Intelligence secures destiny. A decisive military victory achieved through superior intelligence permanently alters the strategic initiative and validates the use of decryption as a critical tool of warfare. Midway defined the next 3 years of the Pacific War. While intelligence broke the Japanese code, American technology, specifically radar and advanced damage control, provided a crucial tactical advantage that amplified the success of the ambush. Radar's unsung role, compelling evidence, U.S. carriers in Midway Atoll possessed rudimentary CXAM radar units. On the morning of June 4th, the Midway radar operator spotted the inbound Japanese strike force at a distance of 93 miles, providing a critical 35-minute warning before the planes arrived. This early warning allowed the American fighters, primarily the Set-4F Wildcats, to scramble in time and provided a decisive tactical edge, ensuring the Japanese strike lost the element of complete surprise, a strategic imperative for Yamamoto. Insightful expert, quote, "The strategic use of radar was a stark contrast to the Japanese fleet, which relied primarily on visual reconnaissance and picket lines. This technological disparity confirmed the growing gap in electronic warfare capabilities between the two navies." Vivid example. The quick rearming and relaunch of the dive bombers from the USS Yorktown, achieved with speed and coordination despite the earlier attack, demonstrated the superior damage control and logistical capacity of the American fleet, a vital and doctrinal advantage the Japanese lacked. The rich explanation for the American technological edge is that the U.S. Navy doctrine heavily invested in damage control and redundant systems, like radar, viewing the survivability of the ship as paramount, whereas Japanese doctrine focused narrowly on offensive firepower. Technology multiplies capability. The integration of early warning radar and superior damage control doctrine provides a crucial force multiplier, amplifying the impact of surprise and improving survivability. Midway was a technological ambush. The land-based air power stationed on Midway Atoll played a unique and often underappreciated role in both executing the initial reconnaissance and serving as the decoy that confirmed the Japanese trap. The land-based sacrifices. Compelling evidence. The initial American sorties were launched from Midway itself, comprising a disparate group of aircraft, including outdated Vought SB-2U Vindicators and, most effectively, PBY Catalina reconnaissance flying boats. It was a PBY Catalina that first spotted the Japanese fleet, delivering the critical location report that confirmed the intelligence and allowed Admiral Nimitz to execute the ambush plan, validating the strategic decision to hold Midway. Insightful expert, quote, "The land-based planes launched a series of ineffective but aggressive torpedo and bombing runs against the Japanese fleet, suffering nearly total annihilation, a statistical reality of almost 90% loss, but further consuming Japanese fuel and forcing Nagumo to keep his air. Patrol engaged. Vivid example. The American Marines' defense of the atoll on the ground and in the air proved that Midway was not an easy target. The Japanese strike had failed to neutralize the airfield completely, forcing Nagumo's hand toward a second attack and committing his ordnance to land targets. The rich explanation for the high casualty rate is the sheer disparity in quality. The outdated American land-based planes were no match for the Japanese Zero Squo, but their sheer aggressiveness and refusal to yield contributed to the breakdown of the Japanese defense's cohesion. Decoy confirms the trap. Land-based air power, despite being technologically outmatched, serves the crucial function of confirming enemy location and acting as an aggressive decoy. Midway's planes bought vital time. The strategic brilliance of the U.S. was amplified by the profound command failure and rigid doctrinal thinking within the Japanese leadership, particularly Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, over complexity and rigidity. Compelling evidence. Yamamoto's plan was excessively complex, relying on a rigid operational timetable and a complex system of decoy forces, the Aleutian Strike, and distant reserve battleships, a strategy that crumbled the moment surprise was lost. Yamamoto's primary tactical commander, Admiral Nagumo, was isolated from the battle fleet, receiving confused and delayed orders, which led directly to the pivotal command decision to initiate the second, fatal rearming sequence. Insightful expert, quote, "The Japanese doctrine suffered from a fatal flaw, its rigidity. It provided no contingency for the loss of surprise or the need for a rapid shift in offensive posture, leaving commanders like Nagumo paralyzed by conflicting priorities. Vivid example. Even after the 3 carriers were destroyed, Yamamoto initially refused to believe the catastrophic reports. His delayed and hesitant decision to retreat cost the Japanese valuable hours that could have been used to save personnel and resources. The rich explanation for the command failure is the Japanese Navy's traditional reliance on a decisive battle. Doctrine that prioritized aggressive offense over the logistical realities of air warfare, failing to adapt to the fluid, intelligence-driven nature of the conflict. Rigidity invites disaster. A complex military plan that relies on surprise and a rigid timetable is catastrophically vulnerable to a single, successful intelligence failure. Yamamoto's strategy broke under pressure. The end of the battle brought a wave of silent, psychological devastation across the Japanese fleet and a sense of grim reality to the American forces. The unspoken loss. Compelling evidence. The Japanese attempted to maintain absolute secrecy regarding the loss. News of the defeat was suppressed, and returning personnel were often isolated and warned not to discuss the true statistical reality of the loss, a profound blow to national morale. For the American airmen who survived the annihilation of the torpedo squadrons, the relief of victory was tempered by the immense psychological burdens of witnessing the total sacrifice of their comrades, a trauma that veterans carried for life. Insightful expert, quote, "The loss of the Japanese veteran aircrews was a deep psychological scar. The Japanese training program, having lost its best instructors and the core of its experience, was immediately crippled, forcing them to send less trained pilots into subsequent battles, confirming the long-term qualitative decline." Vivid example. For the U.S., the victory was a validation of the intelligence effort and a powerful morale boost that energized the home front in the Pacific Fleet, shifting the entire national narrative from defensive recovery to aggressive expansion. The rich explanation for the psychological impact is the realization that the initial American losses, like the Yorktown and the torpedo squadrons, were merely the price of admission to a battle that yielded an incalculably larger permanent strategic victory. Secrecy fuels denial. The suppression of catastrophic military losses creates national denial and prevents a necessary shift in war strategy. Midway's truth was hidden for years. The Battle of Midway was not just a victory. It was the final, definitive strategic confirmation that naval air power was the supreme force in modern warfare, creating a permanent geopolitical shift. The carrier's supremacy, compelling evidence. The battle permanently validated the aircraft carrier as the supreme capital ship, rendering the battleship obsolete for decisive offensive action. The war in the Pacific would henceforth be a race to build and deploy air power. The American industrial capacity, which was already shifting into high gear, was now singularly focused on the one asset that guaranteed victory: the construction of new carriers and the training of thousands of new pilots, overwhelming Japan's limited industrial base. Insightful expert, quote, "Midway was the most decisive naval battle in history since Trafalgar. It effectively eliminated the Japanese Navy's ability to conduct large-scale decisive offensive operations, condemning them to a long, grueling defensive war of attrition. Vivid example. The geopolitical ripple was immediate. The U.S. was able to launch the Guadalcanal campaign just 2 months later, using the secure lines of communication provided by the Midway victory, locking Japan into an immediate, irreversible war of attrition. The rich explanation for the battle's legacy is that it was a triumph of intangibles: intelligence, technological foresight, radar damage control, and disciplined opportunism, proving that the foundation of modern warfare is information and industrial scale, not just guns and armor. Innovation defines victory. A single, decisive battle can validate a new form of military technology and doctrine, defining the strategic landscape for generations. Midway inaugurated the era of the carrier. While the focus often remains on the carriers, the success of Midway was purchased by the resilience and discipline of the individual American aircrews, particularly those who flew the disastrous initial strikes. Resilience in the face of annihilation. Compelling evidence. The pilots of the TBD Devastator torpedo squadrons, who suffered the nearly 95% casualty rate, knew they were flying obsolete, slow aircraft into the heart of the Japanese defenses with virtually no fighter escort. Their commitment to the mission was absolute. Flying straight and level into a wall of Zero fire, their attack drew the entire Japanese combat air patrol, CAP, down to sea level, creating the essential high-altitude window for the dive bombers. Insightful expert, quote, "The American pilots' determination was so fierce that Japanese observers were shocked by the unwavering, suicidal persistence of the attack, demonstrating a moral courage that transcended the technical disparity of their aircraft." Vivid example. The subsequent attack by the ECSBD Dauntless. Dive bombers succeeded because the American crews possessed a high standard of navigation and discipline. McCluskey's ability to spot the destroyer wake and lead his squadron to the target was an act of navigational genius under extreme pressure. The rich explanation for the American aircrew's discipline, even in the face of annihilation, is their robust, high-volume training system which, unlike the Japanese reliance on a small veteran corps, emphasized aggressive mission completion above all else. Discipline unlocks opportunity. The unwavering commitment of aircrews to a doomed attack can inadvertently create the essential tactical opportunity for a subsequent, decisive strike. The torpedo pilot's sacrifice was the key to victory. The simultaneous Japanese attack on the Aleutian Islands, designed as a diversion, proved to be a costly and ultimately pointless distraction that highlighted the strategic rigidity of Yamamoto's overall plan. The pointless diversion. Compelling evidence. The Japanese attacked Dutch Harbor and occupied the islands of Attu and Kiska as part of a complex deception designed to draw U.S. carriers away from Midway. Thanks to Magic's intelligence, Admiral Nimitz correctly dismissed the Aleutians as a secondary threat, deploying only a small reserve force north while positioning his main carrier strength near Midway, thereby neutralizing the entire diversionary strategy. Insightful expert quote, "The commitment of resources, including a separate carrier group and battleships, to the Aleutians was a crucial strategic misallocation. The forces used there could have provided a decisive reserve for the main attack on Midway, potentially altering the battle's outcome." Vivid example. The American intelligence officers, knowing the Japanese primary target was AF Midway, recognized the Aleutian attack as the desperate gambit it was, highlighting this power of code breaking to neutralize sophisticated military deception. The rich explanation for the Aleutians' cost is that the occupation required the commitment of Japanese troops and naval resources for over a year, resources that were desperately needed elsewhere in the expanding Pacific defensive perimeter, condemning Japan to a costly, geographically, overextended war. Deception is useless when known. A complex strategic deception plan collapses entirely when the enemy possesses the intelligence to identify the true primary target. The Aleutians confirmed the power of magic. The speed and totality of the Japanese defeat were fundamentally rooted in a series of critical logistical and doctrinal failures on the part of the Imperial Japanese Navy, IJN. Failure to secure the decks. Compelling evidence. The IJN doctrine prioritized overwhelming offensive power and speed over damage control and safety. When Admiral Nagumo ordered the double rearming of the second strike from anti-ship to land attack bombs, then back to anti-ship ordnance, he violated basic safety protocols. Thousands of bombs, torpedoes, and fuel hoses were scattered across the hangar decks, turning the carriers into giant, highly volatile bombs. This logistical chaos ensured that the first American hits would ignite a catastrophic chain reaction explosion that doomed the ships. Insightful expert, quote, "Unlike the U.S. Navy, the Japanese Navy lacked an efficient system for jettisoning aircraft fuel and volatile ordnance quickly. This inability to clear the hangar decks of flammable material in the minutes before the attack sealed the fate of the three carriers. Vivid example. The American carriers, despite being hit, Yorktown, demonstrated superior damage control. This was a doctrinal difference. The American focus on redundancy and survivability contrasted fatally with the Japanese focus on maximizing offense at the expense of defensive stability. The rich explanation for the logistical failure is that the IJN had never faced a surprise counterattack of this magnitude before. Their doctrine, built on the assumption of tactical surprise and quick victory, simply failed to cope with the reality of an enemy that knew their plan and hit them first. Safety protocols dictate survival. The failure to prioritize safety and efficient ordnance handling on a carrier deck creates a vulnerability that can turn a small attack into a catastrophic destruction. Logistics lost the battle. In the immediate aftermath, the Japanese High Command executed a massive, systematic political cover-up of the Battle of Midway to prevent national panic and conceal the devastating statistical reality of the loss. Denial of disaster. Compelling evidence. Japanese Navy personnel were immediately sworn to secrecy, ordered not to discuss the loss of the 4 fleet carriers. The public and most of the military were fed a deliberately false narrative of American losses, obscuring the true strategic defeat. Admiral Yamamoto was forced to issue false casualty reports, confirming a culture of institutional denial that persisted throughout the war and fundamentally impaired the Japanese ability to develop a rational long-term strategy. Insightful expert, quote, "The cover-up prevented a necessary strategic reassessment. The Japanese continued to fight under the illusion of naval supremacy, committing resources to offensive actions that were now strategically impossible due to the permanent imbalance of carrier strength." Vivid example. The returning Japanese airmen were often confined or reassigned, preventing the spread of the truth about the annihilation. This act of suppressing information was a profound psychological blow to the nation's morale, even if the public did not realize the scale of the loss until much later. The rich explanation for the cover-up is the Japanese military's cultural doctrine of Gombatsu's militarism, which prioritized the appearance of invincibility and imperial honor over the pragmatic needs of military planning, fatally crippling their ability to wage a war of attrition. Secrecy cripples strategy. The deliberate suppression of catastrophic military facts prevents necessary strategic shifts and condemns a nation to a war based on false assumptions. Midway's truth was a dangerous secret. The Battle of Midway was the final, definitive strategic confirmation that the war in the Pacific would be won by American industrial supremacy and the ability to convert intelligence into decisive action. The triumph of production. Compelling evidence. The U.S. industrial machine, already mobilized for total war, accelerated its production of the one asset that mattered most: aircraft carriers and escort ships. The U.S. could build a new carrier faster than Japan could train a new veteran aircrew. The statistical reality of production, the ability to replace all losses and rapidly eclipse the Japanese fleet, confirmed that the strategic balance of power had shifted permanently from the qualitative superiority of the Japanese veteran force to the quantitative superiority of the American industrial base. Insightful expert, quote, Midway secured the vital American lines of communication, enabling the U.S. to launch the Guadalcanal campaign just 2 months later, initiating the island-hopping campaign that would relentlessly wear down the Japanese defensive perimeter. Vivid example. The victory confirmed the genius of Admiral Nimitz's willingness to bet everything on signals, intelligence, magic, validating the role of cryptography as the ultimate, unseen strategic weapon of the war. The rich explanation for the battle's legacy is that it was a victory of foresight over tradition. It confirmed that the future of naval warfare belonged to the nation that could master technology, intelligence, and industrial output, ensuring the ultimate, inevitable Allied victory. Industry ensures destiny. A decisive military victory, coupled with overwhelming industrial capacity, transforms the war of maneuver into a war of attrition that guarantees the final outcome. Midway defined the path to Tokyo,